Hello, friends. Gonna tackle the current kind of topic which is going around everyone's mind, everyone's feeds, which is the recent assassination of Kirk. Um, Charlie Kirk, this conservative, however you want to call him, pundit in the U.S. So I wrote a Substack piece, which is kind of about, not exclusively about this, but sort of about um, the death of the left, basically. I think this act marks the death of the contemporary left, we could say, not necessarily any sort of left wing project, because history is long and wide, and there's room for lots of things which we don't even haven't even imagined yet. So, well, I don't want to make a completely bombastic statement, but I think the contemporary left. Um, when I say this as someone who's kind of got into politics through the left, and kind of dabbled in some different kind of political groups. This is during the 2008 crash, or aftermath of the 2008 crash. I was quite young, 2008 crash, but the aftermath. When there was austerity in Europe, a lot of country I'm from, there was a lot of austerity, and there was an explosion of kind of political intrigue and political discontent, and there was this kind of interesting time actually, and there was a lot of protest against various sorts of privatization of public resources and austerity measures and this kind of thing. And there was a question in the air at the time about like the legitimacy of capitalism. It was quite, I remember like Zizek was quite popular around this time because he was like one of the people that says, okay, Fukuyama, but what about after this financial crash? What about this question of capitalism? And of course, this led to kind of a bit more of a more fundamental kind of political thinking rather than just nitpicking about this issue or that issue, or kind of more fundamental political thinking about the history of the world. And I kind of became interested. And the left was the kind of outlet for that at the time. That the right wasn't in any way thinking in these big terms. It is a bit more today, but it wasn't at the time. Um, the right at the time was basically completely politically unengaged at all, and it kind of refused to become engaged until various things happened later on, like lockdowns, culture wars, and so on. Um, but anyway, so I came from that direction, and I've seen how it's changed over time, and you've had the emergence of a kind of more, kind of, I would say, a more philosophic and a more engaged right wing, we could say, and a change in the character of the left, um, away from what it used to be, and I would say away from both the '60s and the kind of pre-'60s kind of socialists, kind of kind of classically Marxian left, and then the kind of '60s left, and then the kind of, let's say, the 2010s kind of online era, the internet era left. I would say you could sort of package the left into those three different categories, and they're a little bit similar in many ways, but they're very different in many ways. And the contemporary expression of the left, I think, is over. I think it's dead. I think it's this act marked a sort of complete end to it. It's killed itself, basically. So I wanted to make a short little recording and just discuss in what sense it's changed, and and maybe talk a little bit about political violence as well, so-called political violence, because I want to put a question mark over the political designation in that term, which is going to be talked about a lot in the next few weeks, few months. It's going to be the word political violence is kind of becoming is back in our vocabulary, and I want to put a little question mark over that term. But first, maybe discuss sort of like what's happened to the left and how it's changed and so forth. Um, this is a bit complicated, and I do talk about it a bit in the Substack article. You should go read it. Um, but I think what you can basically designate what's happened to the left, other than the internet, but that's happened to everyone, um, is basically it's now a completely biopolitical entity. I think that's the difference between what it is now and what it used to be. Even in the '60s and that era, you know, so the part of our problem in the English speaking world is our frameworks of left and right and politics are very simplistic. Um, the Anglosphere, compared to continental Europe, is very simpleton town thinking, basically. The Anglosphere has these very, very, very outdated and kind of reductive categorizations of things, and it normally appeals to these very sort of abstract and historically illiterate, mostly, um, kind of abstractions of left, right, order, chaos, blah 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 blah. The kind of Anglosphere commentary loves this stuff. It's very simple. It's one and two and three. He's over there. She's over there. Easy. Um, the I would point here again to someone I've made a video on recently, which is the theorist Olivier Waugh, a French theorist who has talked about not just the left but the right too, but in general a change in culture in basically from the '60s, because he's a boomer, and he's like a looked at the changes in the culture and in politics from the '60s to today. And not just, by the way, in the West too. He does it with Islam as well. He does it with the Islamic cultures. He studies. I think he was a student of Islamic history and culture when he was younger. Um, and he's noticed there's been a change in um, one thing he says about the left in particular is that they're no longer utopian. The young of our time are no longer utopian. So you people might, conservatives or centrists might be inclined to kind of accuse the left of being utopian, but I think this is a mistake. I don't think they are utopian. They're obsessed with the apocalypse. They're obsessed with the end of the world. Climate change is going to kill us all. They're post-humanist, transhumanist most of the time these days. They kind of designate the end of mankind. And I think you could say the same thing about history, the kind of apocalypticism of the end of history. It's the end of time. It's the end of human subjectivity, historical subjectivity. I think that they're completely symptoms of that. They don't really challenge that at all. I think their demands, the way they deal with politics, the way they deal with society and history, it's never like fundamental or truly philosophical or really revolutionary either. It's always kind of, they always demand these sort of palliative kind of forms of care. This is where the biopolitics comes out of: the care, the consideration, the affirmation, they kind of want the pre-existing system to sort of absorb them and just sort of affirm them and comfort them and reward them better. They don't really have a revolutionary kind of politics, and they're very reformist. If you look at the way they kind of have this very middle class sort of perspective of bad behavior and bad speech and bad this and bad that. We have to reform. They're kind of Puritans nearly, So that's basically how, well, I would say society at large has changed, but interestingly, particularly the left. They're no longer revolutionary. They're no longer truly radical, you could say. They're immoderate. It's not necessarily the same thing as radical. They're no longer utopian. They're apocalyptic. They're socially reformist and sort of puritanical. They're not sort of Dionysian like they were in the '60s and '70s. They're not sort of open to kind of crazy experiences. They're sort of closed off, extremely neurotic, closed off to anything like that. So they've changed a lot, and therefore, we need to sort of address political violence in the same historical framework and say, well, then, how is this violence then maybe in some way similar because it's violence, but different to historical comparisons? Because I already see a lot of bad comparisons being brought out. The JFK assassination, which actually is adequate in the sense of like, I mean, presuming it was a lone crazed gunman, I suppose you could say it looks like a kind of mentally disturbed person who's kind of become fixated on a public figure. So I suppose there is a somewhat of a comparison, but there you'd have to sort of you'd also make the contrast that JFK was a president and Kirk was a pundit. And has there ever been a pundit that's been assassinated before? I mean, people in the public eye have been attacked before. They've been like, they've had things thrown at them, or some crazy person might try to punch them or something. It's happened before, but the level of planning, the level of planning and training you'd have to go into. You could imagine there's a public event and there's a public figure and someone is just there and they're a bit mad anyway, and they lose their temper and they attack them. Okay, you can sort of see that they might get caught in the moment, but like the planning of a sort of a sniper attack, I mean, the level of planning and organization is pretty long term and big. There's a lot of wiggle room in the middle there to sort of calm down and say, all right, well, this is a bit too much effort. This is a bit too stupid. Like this is not going to go. There's a lot of there's a lot of wiggle room for kind of rationalizing your way out of the stupid decision. Someone who's done something like this has had months, at least months of planning and preparation in which their rational mind never kind of said, what, this is not a good idea. So I'm not inclined to. I'm inclined to sort of say, well, has that level of planning ever been directed at a YouTuber, at a pundit before? No, it hasn't. Right? It hasn't. Presidents, yes, because presidents are presidents. They make decisions, and if you kind of tell yourself that this president will make a lot of decisions that will destroy society, and this person's a tyrant and they're going to do horrible things, you can sort of, I mean, whether or not it's true is another question, but you can sort of see where the rationalization that they're coming from. But a pundit, no, like they don't have any political making decisions. They're just a pundit, So I was thinking hard about this, and I was like, has there ever been something like this before? And then I thought, well, in the 90s, there was a journalist called Veronica Guerin who was killed by the IRA in Ireland. But then I started to think, well, this isn't actually similar. I was trying to think, have media figures been assassinated before? Like not attacked out of a random moment at a public event, but like planned assassination, a long-term planned assassination. And then I thought Veronica Guerin, but then I thought, well, that's a bit different because she wasn't a pundit, she was an investigative journalist. And she was planning, or she was looking into basically what happened, and that was that she was looking into the connection that the IRA had to drug gangs. So the IRA at the time was using its connections to drug gangs, basically drug dealers, in order to fund itself. Kind of similar to, I think, some of the narco-communist groups in South America, for example, right? And she was a journalist working for a newspaper, and kind of old school investigative journalist. Like she wasn't necessarily like a publicly known figure. Investigative journalists generally aren't kind of famous, right? Unless they're assassinated or something, then they become famous. But she was assassinated. But that kind of makes sense. I mean, I'm not saying it's ethically justified. I'm not justifying ethically. I'm making it like a rationalization. Like you could see that it wasn't personal. It was like they killed her because she was going to expose their criminal behavior, and they didn't want that, so they killed her in order to cover it up, which normally just actually creates more attention, puts more attention on it, but whatever, right? Um, so no, right? It's not actually a fair comparison because Kirk was not a investigative journalist with any power to expose anybody. He was literally just a pundit. So there you go. And then you start to think about, well, the use of terror. So people are saying that this was a terror attack and there's a use of terror. I'm not saying that's not true, but it's just that I would complicate it and ask the questions. Well, what's its goal? Because, for example, the goal of a terror attack could be from a nationalist group. Like give the IRA example again. Um, the the goal is to use terror to try get a sovereign state. Now you can disagree with the means of going about that, but you can sort of understand the ends. You can sort of understand um, the goal that violence is being used to achieve. Um, you could say, kind of revolutionary violence, terror, French Revolution, or the communists, for example. They're sort of trying to achieve a new society, though, aren't they? They're sort of trying to defeat the pre-existing power structures because they have a sort of coherent view of a new society, and they're trying to sort of actualize that, and they're using terror maybe to sort of, as a weapon, to achieve that. And again, like, disagree with that all you want. Fair enough. I think normally it's a bad tool to use. I think it's fair enough. But there's at least a kind of coherent understanding of a new society, and that isn't the case with this situation. Like, what new society are the left, however you want to categorize them, trying to achieve? They don't have any vision. Like what? Like, what do they want? Who knows? Are they Marxists? Are they socialists? Are they Democrats? Are they social democrats? Are they this? Are they that? Are they liberals? No one knows, because these people don't read enough books, to be honest with you, to actually have that sort of coherent vision of a world. They just spend all their time on social media, and that does not give you a coherent vision of the world. That gives you a kind of peculiar, distorted simulacra of reality, and that doesn't lead to much coherence, and it doesn't lead to much vision, and it doesn't lead to much, like, it doesn't actually even lead to utopianism either, because I think you kind of have to have some coherence to have utopianism. It leads to just a distorted view of reality in which you kind of have a hyper reality. We can really call it like a hyper reality, in which you're constantly exposed to images of things which are in some sense real, but it's so incoherent and sort of atomized and sort of chronic and sort of peculiar and kind of destructured and deconstructed, and that it just leads to this sort of, I don't know, is this some sort of mental virus or something? Like, it doesn't lead to coherence at all. So I do think in some sense you have to look at these events in their historical context, and in this context, it's not utopian, it's something else. It's not doesn't really have a clear aim at all. It seems to act purely within the media ecosystem. Like, I would imagine that the shooter sort of thought to himself, I'll do this, and then all the internet will be talking about it for weeks. Of course they will, but, like, what's the aim there? I mean, just to get just to sort of stimulate the sort of media machinery. That seems to be one possible motivation, but it's a very peculiar motivation, and it's not anything we're used to seeing before. It's a kind of purely media activity. Like the goal is to get the internet to talk about something, right? It's not really a political goal. That's why I'm putting the question mark over political violence. This is more like, I would say this is more media violence than political violence, because there's no clear political end here at all. Okay, what else? I would also, I think, worth pointing out the biopolitical nature to, well, I would say contemporary society, but in this situation, I suppose you have to talk about the left because it's an act that was conducted by a left-wing orientated person. Whatever that means, of course, is a big, is a good question. But roughly speaking, um, did so. Okay, what is biopolitics? Right, the simple explanation of biopolitics is it's kind of relates to power structures in a society that are to do with, I would say, health and security primarily. I mean, there's questions over like the body and the protection of the body. I think Foucault made this distinction where like you had the kind of sovereign right of the king to kill and then to execute, and then that got replaced. I'm not a big Foucault reader, so correct me in the comments if I'm a little bit mistaken on this. But then that got replaced by the sort of protection of the protection of people, like the kind of right to protect, this sort of society of security and health. This kind of preservation took over from execution, we could say. But there, and you could say, well, that's a good thing, right? Hold on, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. Execution bad, preservation is good. well, maybe not. Like not necessarily. Not necessarily. Preservation is a much more complicated thing, and often I think preservation can be much darker than people give credit to. And I think one of the reasons that we struggle to see that is because we're informed by the kind of Anglosphere utilitarianism. Basically, utilitarianism just is a retarded doctrine. It's just the stupidest doctrine that's ever lived, and it's very much just a very simple kind of vulgar sort of shopkeepers, to use Nietzsche's sort of understanding, kind of shopkeepers' understanding of the world. Pleasure, safety, good; pain, risk, bad. And now, no society really thinks like this. But the utilitarianism that comes out of like John Stuart Mill or something, like there is a certain section of the kind of 19th century English intelligentsia, we could say, that maybe I think it might have been a reaction to the French Revolution or something, but had a kind of very, very vulgar like kind of understanding of society and the goals and aims of society and so on, which is very utilitarian. And I think that the Americans adopted that to some extent too. Now it's not everyone, and of course it's not the entire society, and it's only a very small portion of the society. But nonetheless, it has had an effect on the way we think over time. And one of the reasons that we have trouble sort of engaging in the kind of a discussion about something like biopolitics, because most people just sort of have this like knee-jerk response, which is pain and conflict bad, pleasure and safety good. It is, but anyway, like Agamben is a good example of this. Giorgio Agamben, who has this theory on Homo sacer, and I wrote this in the Substack piece, so go check the Substack piece out if you want more detail on this. But Homo sacer is basically the person who is in society, but he can't. Sorry, but he can. So he's in society, but he can be killed with impunity. So imagine like you live in a society, but like you don't have the sort of legal protection of that most people do. Like no murder. It's like a rule, right? It's like a rule. No murder, no killing. That applies to everyone, but Homo sacer doesn't have that. Homo sacer can be killed, but he's not immediately killed, and he's not immediately exiled. He's sort of, so he's not executed in this kind of formal sense, like you'd execute a political enemy, for example, like the execution of whatever, Mussolini or something, right? Like after Mussolini was, I think he was executed, maybe he killed himself, but anyway, you understand what I'm saying. Execution of a political enemy. And Homo sacer is someone who is not actually executed. They're sort of kept alive but at the same time they have no sort of like recognized right to life at the same time. But they're kept alive anyway. So there's a kind of dehumanizing position that Homo sacer has. He's not allowed. He's not allowed to be a martyr. He's not allowed to sort of die on his knee, on his sorry, not on his knees, die on his feet. He sort of has to live on his knees and live under the constant instability of being deprived the kind of legal protection and recognition which other people have, which is that if someone murders you, they'll be held accountable for it. Now, of course, these theories sort of came out of a reaction also to World War II and the concentration camps and so on and so forth. And typically, that has been what people have had in mind when they think about this stuff. In the modern world, we sort of think the modern world is universalistic and it has a sense of, the modern West anyway, is universalistic and had a sense of, universal justice, universal rights, and so on. But there was this, but things went terribly wrong, like during the mid 20th century, and then you had these examples of something weird, which was the Homo sacer situation. But then that ended, and then everything's okay. But actually, not really, because if you look at the way things have gone since like the lockdowns and cancel culture, all this stuff, there is a kind of Homo sacer logic to all of this, that you have people in society that are clearly like antagonistic to a status quo or a regime. Let's call this the kind of neoliberal regime, and these people are not really given any sense of fair trial or fair kind of right to self-defense, fair trial. They can be, I suppose, like killed is a bit extreme, of course. I don't want to pretend that this is people are being killed en masse or something, but like prior to this event, you do have things like reputational sabotage, loss of job, debanking in some situations, and sometimes even kind of accusations in courtrooms which lead to things like fines or some various sorts of punishments, not death, but various sorts of punishments that largely happen without your right to defend yourself or to be given a kind of fair process. Someone is accused in the kind of cancel culture society of making a faux pas, they can be fired, and there's not really a process to sort of combat that, and say, well, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean that, or whatever. It's just done, right? So people have been living in this. I think this is one of the reasons this event has resonated with a lot of people, is because people have been living in this society, not with death necessarily, but with lower scale, lower level feelings of kind of, you can't defend yourself. Like, you're in the society, you're part of the society, but like you can just be accused of something at any time, and like no one's gonna like stick to a sort of enlightened process of trial to figure out whether or not that's true, and apologize if it's not true, and hold the person who's lied about you accountable, for example. That's never happening. I mean, look at the whole Me Too movement and so on. It's like you can basically just say anything about somebody, about a man, and they'll have to go through a big process of defending themselves, both in the court of public opinion and maybe even in the legal courts. And they may have lost their job, they may have had to pay a load of legal fees, they may have lost their social circle, and at the end of the day, the person who's basically just lied is just let off the hook. They're like, oh, well, whatever. Right? I mean, this is Homo sacer. This is like a less intense version of it, but it's still Homo sacer. And this is the point, I think, about what the left has become. It's become a biopolitical entity, and it sort of creates these new categorizations of putting people in these sort of indefensible positions where they can't defend themselves or retaliate, and constantly accusing people of things, lying about people, getting them fired, ruining their reputations and so forth. And they seem to be used as a tool by the establishment. And I don't think they're acting alone here. I think they're being indulged by the establishment. um, in order to basically basically control and intimidate people. Because if you put people in the homo sacer position in society, they're kind of scared and they're sort of intimidated and they're demoralized, and they're less likely to stand up against an oligarchy, which is we do live under an oligarchy today. There's no doubt about that. So they're less likely to stand up against an oligarchy. So just to kind of push the point home a little bit about the biopolitical aspect to all this, is if you look online, I don't recommend you do because you will go crazy, but if you look a little bit online at the people justifying the killing, which is probably more shocking than the killing itself, because one crazy dude is one crazy dude, but a society full of people that are like, oh yeah, he deserved it, is much worse than that description. This is really, really bad. I've seen a few clips, and just I've had conversations with people over the years, not about this, not about assassinations, but just about things like the Me Too things, like about accusing people of things. And so if you push them into a kind of Socratic dialogue, and some people, I've done this, and some people will just will just sort of defecate on the floor and throw it at you, but some people will actually engage with you with a kind of dialogue, about something like this, and you'll say to them, okay, well then, okay, well in this situation it's a bit different because someone was killed, but generally, you might say, why did he deserve it? Right? Why did this person who was lied about, or who was in this case assassinated, but generally who was lied about or debanked or punished, basically? I think this is Foucauldian. I think this is the left acting as the Foucauldian tyranny, I think, basically. Punishing people, and if you ask them, okay, well, what did they do to deserve this? What did they do to deserve this? Push. You will basically hear that they said things about particular people who were sensitive and scared, and that hurt them. This is what you'll get. So it's biopolitics. It's health and security. It's health and security. It's health and security. This person broke a code of health and security. That's what you'll get. Now it's wrapped up in all this ethical and political and social rhetoric, but it doesn't matter. It's biopolitics. It's health and security. Normally, in this case, it's emotional harm. Actually, this person's speech or their online activity or what they said was insensitive to X, Y, Z group. Okay, well, what does that mean, insensitive? Well, it means basically it hurt their feelings, and this is sort of transmuted into an act, like a physical act of aggression or violence against them. It's not, of course. It's just words. It's just a conversation, but it's transmuted into a sort of physical attack, and then the necessary logic then is that, well, there has to be a retribution or a punishment for that attack, and that can come in the form of the state, should do something, should fine them, their boss should fire them, or like a mob, could be mob justice, right? Or it could be vigilante. And I think it is, the timing of this is not an accident, because Trump's second victory, I think he's put a big break on, let's say, the mechanisms of biopolitical punishment which were there before. So the cancellations and the sort of weaponized courtrooms and the media ecosystem has changed, I think, since Trump's second term, like Musk taking over Twitter. It's become less of, like, the media has become less of a sort of powerful tool of punishment of the general public, because it actually is, it's just the general public, your average people, who are being punished here most of the time. Now people who speak out, of course, but but whatever. the um I would say that the Trump's second, to give Trump credit for something, I don't give him credit for a lot, but I will give him credit for something, and it's that his second term, there just seemed to be a weakening of these tools of media and courtrooms and institutions in their punishment of people, and I think that that's sort of where the vigilanteism comes from. You see, because it's like, if you think, okay, well, these people are like harming X, Y, and Z's identity groups' feelings, if they're like harming their feelings, and that's literally violence, um, um, and there needs to be retribution and justice for that. Well, then if people are getting fired, they're getting cancelled, they're getting lied about, if they're getting brought to courtrooms and fined or maybe put in jail for things, well, then people feel, well, at least something's happening. But then when that goes away, you see, well, now you need vigilante justice, because justice isn't being done the normal way. So there you go. You have these sorts of actions. So it's a kind of vigilante biopolitical act, basically. I would say that that's what it is. I think on Twitter I called it I called Antifa the therapeutic militia, because they're like a militia who normally they're attacking whoever they're attacking because that person is hurting the feelings of another group. That's actually why they're animated, like what they're animated by. It's not to physically protect people against whatever, like brown shirts in the streets, because there are no brown shirts in the streets. Not in our time. There were historically, but they're not in our time. It's not to protect people from institutional exploitation from big capital. They don't care about big capital. They're totally on board with big capital. It's not to protect people from institutional corruption or exploitation or from the market, which was what the traditional Marxists wanted to do. It's not to protect people from like physical harm, brown shirts, because there are none. They're not really strong enough or courageous enough to like take on the police if the police do something bad. They never normally do that. They normally attack protesters. They don't normally attack like the police. Give you an example, like during the lockdowns, I remember there was a protest of people who were just obviously naturally and justifiably frustrated and confused with the whole quarantine measures, and they didn't understand what was going on. I don't think any of us did. And they were protesting somewhere, and I can't remember where it was. It might have been in the UK, it might have been in America, could have been in Western Europe, I can't remember where. But guess who showed up to counter protest? Antifa. Antifa showed up, to counter protest. A bunch of ordinary people, probably very working class people, who just didn't want to be fucking stuck inside in a council flat or in a small apartment for months and months and months on end, and had economic anxieties about whether their job would be secure when they left, who just didn't like the situation and didn't feel like they were being treated well, and completely justifiably so, and did a little protest, and then Antifa show up. Why? To put them in their place. You've broken health and security code number 4478. We're gonna get you. All right, this is what they are. Therapeutic militia. Again, like just to caution people, centrists or the right or classical liberals, whoever you are, against saying that this is political violence and saying that these people are politically radicalized. Do you think these people are reading books? Do you think these people are reading radical political books? This is again this sort of motif that comes from kind of centrist or conservative commentators about like the university professors like radicalizing people. I'm not saying the university professors wouldn't like to do that, but I just don't think you can radicalize people who don't read bloody books and aren't interested in reading books. You can't academically radicalize people who don't read. They're not these people are post-political and they're post-literate. Like every single person that you want to put in this category of they're radical or they're radicalized, whatever words you want to use, Antifa, trans, whatever you want to, lots of different terms, and these terms are very sort of, interchangeable and incoherent anyway. But whatever you want to put it, these people, if you actually look at the people, they're half literate. I would say they're half literate, basically. Like they're not really, they're not like kind of counter elites engaged. Like, again, it's like elite overproduction thing. And okay, counter elites read. You know what I mean? Like these people don't. These people don't. They're half literate, media addicted, um, people with probably with Munchausen's a lot of the time. Like they have a kind of, and I know people like this. I have someone in my family who's Munchausen's. Like, okay, you're not allowed to say this out loud to them, but basically they're Munchausen's, and you know like they're an entire new category of people in the society, and there's actually, unfortunately, relatively large amount of them. It's not the majority by any stretch of the imagination, of course, but there's a relatively large amount of them, and they are um, post-literate, post-political. They have no political aspirations or goals or vision. They don't care about politics. Um, Politics has become a kind of marketing costume for other things. I think this is the problem. Um, it's difficult because people tell you don't identify too much with politics and make politics everything. Okay, yeah, of course, but these people don't do that at all. They use politics as a costume, not as a fundamental substance that they engage with. Um, but anyway, these people that we're talking about, these so-called radicals, most of them have Munchausen's. They're half literate. They're completely biopolitical. Their only aim is health and safety, health and safety, health and security. They they see um, basically anyone who doesn't sort of like engage in a sort of collective therapeutic affirmation of their own sense of self-esteem, we could say, and affirms their own well, kind of neuroticism, or kind of you know they're they conflate that with a kind of immediate physical threat. They constantly do this, the immediate physical threat. And I don't know why they do this, but I think it might have something to do with psychiatry and the way psychiatry is basically being used within institutions and within institutions primarily, within society in general, um, in which I suppose you could say various forms of kind of collective therapeutic management has been sort of installed on the kind of imposed over the society, in which health and safety is like the only thing. And again, this is a kind of nihilistic byproduct of the end of history and of consumer capitalism and all the rest. There's nothing more to live for. There's nothing. God is dead. History is done. There's nothing sort of there's nothing more. So health and safety, the kind of reductive bare life, to put it in a Gambian terms of health and safety, become the be all and end all everything. And out of that, you sort of have a sort of so-called political subject, and not really political, the biopolitical subject, who basically police the society's faux pas against the codes of health and safety. Everything is health and safety. Everything is health and security. And you have these, like, when you look at like an institution like a university and say they're being radicalized, it's not by books, and it's not by intelligent professors, and it's not by academic exercise that they're being radicalized. It's by biopolitical institutional um, um, uh, dynamics,